A man boards the wrong carriage and never leaves alive. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I'm your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're listening from. It's always a thrill to read your comments. Now, let's begin. The evening rain had begun before Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres, a light drizzle that darkened the pavements and filled the gutters with thin, restless rivulets. He had no particular hurry to return home. His wife would be waiting, of course. There would be a stew simmering, and perhaps a tart cooling by the open kitchen window. But Maigret lingered in the mist, his hat brim wet, his pipe unlit between his teeth. It was a small habit of his to walk for a while after work, letting the day's voices and silences drift away until only the muted sounds of Paris remained. The night was quiet. He found himself wandering toward the Gare de Lyon without really deciding to, pulled there as if by the steady rhythm of the trains and the human tides they carried. A faint smell of coal smoke lingered in the damp air. The station lamps glowed behind a veil of rain. He stopped outside one of the cafes opposite the station where the glass panes were fogged by warmth and crowded with tired travelers bent over bowls of soup. For a few minutes he stood watching, struck by the strange melancholy of such places. People between two lives, pausing only long enough to eat, to smoke, to stare into nothing. Inside he ordered a beer and sat by the window. His coat steamed slightly as it dried. He wasn't thinking of any case in particular. It was more a mood, a sense of human weariness, the kind that clung to railway cafes, to waiting rooms, to people who seemed always in transit. He let his gaze wander among the faces. A woman with red eyes clasped a child's hand. A young man in a rumpled suit drummed nervous fingers on the table. At the far corner, an older fellow with a thin mustache had dozed off with his head tilted back, his empty glass forgotten before him. It was only when Maigret paid and stepped out again that something pricked his attention. Across the street, under the dripping awning of the station, a small knot of porters stood talking. One of them gestured toward the platforms, shaking his head with a half-smile that carried a touch of disbelief. Their voices were carried away by the passing hiss of an engine, but the tone, amused, baffled, slightly uneasy, caught Maigret's ear. He lingered, lighting his pipe now, the smoke curling faintly in the damp air. Passengers hurried in and out of the station, clutching bags and umbrellas. A whistle blew. Somewhere far back, a train door slammed shut, and then, through the glass doors of the waiting hall, he saw two policemen moving slowly, uncertainly, in that way officers do when they aren't yet sure what they've found. They were leading a man between them, a man in a grey overcoat, his collar turned up, his steps unsteady as though he had just woken from a dream. It was not the sight of the man that drew Maigret closer, but rather the way the porters stared, one of them muttering something that made the others fall silent. The words did not reach Maigret, but he felt the echo of them, carried in the look of their faces. A man had been found in the wrong carriage, someone said as Maigret drew near. And though the words were spoken casually, as if describing a traveller's mistake, there was a hush beneath them, the kind that did not belong to chance or accident. Maigret tamped his pipe and drew on it, the taste of tobacco, sharp and familiar. He did not move to speak. Not yet. He stood under the rain, watching as the two policemen escorted the man further inside the station. His gait was slow, almost reluctant, as if every step cost him effort. The porters returned to their murmuring, the story beginning to pass from mouth to mouth, to be shaped and reshaped in the telling. Maigret stayed where he was, breathing in the damp Paris night, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. Something about it, about the man, the silence of the policemen, the glances of the porters, had already settled like a stone in his mind. Not enough to act. Not yet. But enough to keep him from walking home. The man had sat in the wrong carriage. It seemed such a small thing, an error of travel. And yet Maigret, without knowing why, felt that this was how certain mysteries began. Not with a cry of alarm or the discovery of blood, but with a quiet dissonance, as ordinary and as unremarkable as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He adjusted his hat against the rain and followed slowly, silently, into the station. The great clock above the concourse read 10 minutes past 9 when Maigret pushed through the revolving door, the smell of steam and wet wool folding around him like an old coat. He let his eyes adjust, not to the light, yellow and adequate, but to the human temperature of the place. When he was in such a mood, he noticed trifles, the shiver that ran through the glass when a train hooted, the way the kiosk woman licked her thumb before turning a page of the evening paper, a porter rubbing at a shine that would not come on the brass of a luggage scale. He did not look for drama. He preferred to meet the thing sideways, as one meets a draft in a corridor. Near the ticket barriers, a porter with a peaked cap pushed back on his head was still telling the story, his hands making little rowing motions. He had the face of a man who had been standing too many winters in a doorway, red-veined nose, eyes filmed by damp. Maigret let him talk until the gestures slowed of their own accord, and then showed his card without insistence. "Ah, commissaire," the porter said, straightening a little, though no one had told him to. "Léon, it's nothing perhaps, only he was in the wrong carriage." "What makes it wrong, Léon?" They were close enough that Léon's breath, sour with coffee and the ghost of garlic, warmed the space between them. "Not his train, you see. Not anyone's at that hour. They'd just pulled the second class off the 8:50 from Lyon to clean it. Doors open, lights dim to save the battery. He was sitting there as if he belonged. Hat on knees, quiet as a cat. The cleaning girl asked him for his ticket and he showed her one for Montargis, tomorrow morning, first departure." "Tomorrow morning," Maigret repeated, as if tasting the words would change their flavor. Léon nodded, pleased to have given something precise. "That's why she fetched me. We ask him, does he know where he is? He says yes, in a carriage," which was true if not helpful. The chef de train didn't want a story on his hands, with the Nice sleeper waiting to back in, so we let the station police take him to their little room. He isn't drunk, he isn't anything. He's like a man who hears a noise we don't. Beyond the barriers, a draft carried the wet metallic smell of the platforms. People streamed toward the suburban departures, heads down, tickets ready. The whole parade of clerks and shop girls, old men with canvas bags of vegetables, boys going home with boots muddy from work. If you watched long enough, you could see the city breathe, lungs filling and emptying, beats missed. That was where the oddities showed, the soft places. Maigret thanked Léon with a tilt of the hat and moved on. The police room was a glassed-in office wedged under a stair, a place for lost property and petty trouble. Its door was ajar. Inside, a constable with narrow shoulders stood uncertainly, his hand resting on a ledger as if it might steady him. On a wooden chair, hat on his knees just as Léon had said, sat the man in the grey overcoat. He had taken off his gloves and held them together as if they might fly apart. The overcoat was good cloth but tired at the cuffs. He was 50, give or take. His hair had begun to go thin at the temples, leaving the scalp shiny in the electric light. His shoes were carefully polished, and if he had crossed wet streets recently, they hadn't noticed it. The constable looked up, relieved to see Rank appear out of the damp. "Evening, commissaire. We found him, well, they found him." "I know," Maigret said, easy, and offered him his pipe case by habit. The young man refused politely, uncertain if it was a test. "You'll forgive me if I smoke?" "No." "Good." He struck a match, cupped it, drew until the tobacco took. Smoke made a veil that turned the glass walls softer and gave voices a place to sit. He had not yet addressed the man. He looked at him long enough to be a presence, not a question. The man's eyes had that far focus of people who are listening inward. He seemed to be waiting to be told what to do next and prepared to obey in order to be left alone. "Your name," Maigret said at last, not pushing. "Henri Pommier," the man answered, and his voice was agreeable, like a clerk who has spent his life on the right side of politeness. "Address? Rue de Charenton, number 192. He supplied the number after the smallest pause, the kind a man makes to make sure he has said the number he uses when he has to give an address rather than the one he thinks of as home. "4th floor, left. You work late?" "Some evenings." He shifted the gloves and then put them back as they had been. "Bookkeeping, paper wholesaler in the 12th. "And tonight?" "I had time," Pommier said. He glanced toward the glass where people passed like shadows. It was raining. It was not a lie, and it was even almost an explanation. Rain drove people into rooms they had no business occupying, waiting rooms, churches, cafes they never otherwise entered. He could have gone to the buffet. He could have gone home. He had gone to sit in a dark carriage that no longer belonged to any particular train. Maigret drew again on the pipe and let silence do what it always did, shift the pressure until air found a way through the other man. "You have a ticket," the constable ventured, encouraged by the commissaire's quiet. "For tomorrow." "I like to buy them the day before," Pommier said quickly. "I worry about lines. It is a small worry, but it becomes large in the morning." "Montargis," Maigret said, tasting the town as if it were a cheese. "Family there?" "My mother," he said, and the word sat between them with a weight out of proportion to the syllables. "She is unwell. No worse than before." "You live alone?" "No," Pommier said, not briskly but with a firmness that made it not quite true. "With my wife." The constable flicked the corner of the ledger with his nail as if flipping a coin. "Do you want us to call her, to say you're delayed?" "There's a telephone." Pommier gave a small smile that was mostly for himself. "She thinks I'm at the cinema with a colleague. It is not a lie if one does not say which cinema." They could have laughed. They didn't. Maigret noticed the pale circle of skin at Pommier's ring finger, the kind you see on men who take the ring off to wash their hands and have forgotten to put it back, or have not wished to. He noticed a faint scent that wasn't tobacco or wool. Something light, citrus, the kind of cologne the better barbers used if you let them. The overcoat's collar had been brushed recently. The nap lay too flat. "Why that carriage?" Maigret asked at last. The question was gentle, as if he were asking why a man had sat by a particular window in a cafe. Pommier looked surprised, as if there could not be a why. Then he was annoyed at himself for being surprised. It was open, there was a seat, it was quiet. "One sits, no." "No rule against it," the constable said, as if absolving everyone. "Not a rule," Maigret agreed, "but it is a choice. People choose their quiet carefully." He took the pipe from his mouth, tapped the bowl with a finger, and turned to the constable. "Where did they find him exactly?" "Second class. Coach 7 of the 8:50 from Lyon, sir. It had just come in. They were taking off the cars that go back south tonight. Cleaning girl says he was there 10 minutes when she looked, maybe longer." The constable consulted his memory, as if it were in a pocket. He had not the look of a man watching the clock. "Let me see it," Maigret said. They crossed the platform together, the constable going ahead to keep the curious from crowding in. The night had deepened into the kind of rain that is almost invisible and makes everything forget its outline. Under the iron canopy, the carriages loomed, black with soft squares of yellow where bulbs had been left burning. He climbed 3 steps into the coach and stood a moment in the stale air which held the day inside it. Orange peel, newspaper ink, the dregs of wine from a bottle one of the travellers had given up on. There was a damp patch on one seat where a coat had shed itself. On the floor by the door a folded timetable lay caught where boots had pushed it. He picked it up and saw 2 circles in pencil. The morning departure to Montargis, as promised, and, curiously, a train to Nice 2 hours from now. He did not show the timetable to the constable. He slid it into his pocket with the absent gesture of a man who knows he will forget it otherwise and wants to be the one to discover it later. He crouched and ran a finger along the brass footrail. It came away with grime that left a black line on the skin. No blood. Nothing dramatic. Good. He would have been disappointed to be contradicted so early by violence. "You," he said to the cleaning woman who had been standing uncertainly with her bucket, eyes moving between the policemen like a sparrow between eaves. "You saw him?" She nodded vigorously. Her hair was bound in a scarf patterned with faded cherries. "Sitting like a gentleman. Not the kind who makes a mess. He said pardon when I asked for his ticket. His hat was in his lap. He looked as if he was listening to something. Not me." What sort of something? She considered, grateful to be asked seriously, as if a name might be called, or a voice would come from the corridor perhaps. He kept his head turned a little, the way one does when one listens for a kettle. On the platform again, Maigret stood watching a train slide past slowly, each window carrying a fragment of a room. A woman adjusting her hair, a man asleep with his mouth open, two boys elbowing each other in competition over a comic strip. The glass made it all separate and contained. It was an odd thing to envy. Back in the small room, Pommier had not moved. He had the patience of a man who has waited all his life and is not about to waste it now. The constable cleared his throat. "Monsieur says his papers are in order. Identity card, everything." They were. The names matched. The addresses were plausible. He was nobody special, and it felt like the strongest fact in the room. "Tell me the truth, Henri," Maigret said, almost kindly. "Were you waiting for someone who did not arrive?" Pommier's eyes flickered. It was the first sign of life that was not merely the drawing of breath. "One waits for many things," he said. "Sometimes for the rain to end." "Will you go home now?" "Yes," he said. He stood, smoothing the overcoat, settling the hat, the movements precise and unhurried. "I'm sorry to have troubled you. I'm not used to—" He gestured in a way that took in the glass walls, the ledger, the young policeman's anxious posture. Rooms where explanations are expected. "You know," Maigret said, as if it had just occurred to him, "you have circled the Nice train on your timetable." Pommier blinked and then gave a small laugh that did not quite reach his face. "Everyone has dreams, commissaire." He went with the constable as far as the outer door and then made a simple, modest bow that would have been ridiculous on another man. He stepped into the concourse and was lost among a group of soldiers in greatcoats, their capes shining under the lights like seals. "Shall we take his name?" the constable asked, belatedly bureaucratic. "We have it," Maigret said. "We will keep it where it won't be in the way." He wrote it in his own small notebook all the same, against the habit he had told the constable. Henri Pommier, Rue de Charenton, paper wholesaler, mother in Montargis, ring mark, timetable. On the way out he found Léon again without looking for him. The porter tugged at his cap. "It is nothing then, commissaire." "It is often nothing," Maigret said, "until it is not. If you or the cleaning girl see him again tonight, tell the station to ring the quay." He gave a card, without committing anyone to the nuisance of using it. The rain had hardened, tapping now, gentle fingers drumming on the awnings. He thought of his wife, of the stew that would be a little dry by now and not worse for it. He walked past the cafe where his coat had steamed, the windows fogged again with new stories. In a booth near the door, a couple argued in whispers over a saucer of coins. He asked the waiter if there was a telephone and dialed the number from memory, listening to the clicks and the pauses as if they were part of a conversation. When Janvier answered, brisk, pleased to have something to do, Maigret said only, "Nothing urgent." A name to verify. Henri Pommier, Rue de Charenton, bookkeeper. See if the neighbors think him a man who sits in carriages that are not his. No hurry. I'm only curious. He hung up before Janvier could become eager. On the pavement again, he lifted his face to the rain for a second, letting it cool the skin under the hat brim. He had no theory, no plan, only a small stone lodged somewhere behind his breastbone that would not let him call the evening finished. People rarely ever sat by accident exactly where they ended up. They drifted toward their places the way rivers do, meeting the obstacles they were meant to meet. As he turned toward the bridge, a whistle blew behind him, long and plaintive, and he pictured for a moment the circles in pencil on the timetable, 2 rings around 2 different futures, and a man who had used neither. He felt, without yet understanding why, that the error had been deliberate, the way a tired person chooses the wrong key and pretends it might fit for a time, just to hold the door and the decision at bay. He walked on, the city's wet breathing at his back, not hurrying and not delaying, ready to sit with the thing until it agreed to call itself by its name. The following morning, the rain had not lifted. It clung to the rooftops, grey and obstinate, and the Seine ran swollen and restless under the bridges. Maigret left the apartment later than usual, having taken his time over coffee while Madame Maigret fussed at the geraniums on the window ledge. She had asked, not insistently, why he had come in so late the previous night, his shoes damp and his pipe unsmoked. He had shrugged in his heavy way, muttering something about the station. A man, nothing definite. She had not pressed, knowing her husband's silences, and he had kissed the crown of her hair before buttoning his coat. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the squad room was already filled with the clatter of typewriters and the smell of stale tobacco. Janvier appeared almost immediately, his face alert with the satisfaction of having something to report. "I checked the name," he said, falling into step as Maigret hung his coat and hat on the hook outside his office. "Henri Pommier, Rue de Charenton, 4th floor. The neighbors know him. They say he's quiet, punctual, goes to work at the same time every morning. They think he's respectable. Married, yes, though his wife is not often seen. No children." Maigret lowered himself into the chair, which groaned under his weight. He filled his pipe deliberately, tamping the tobacco with a thumb as Janvier stood waiting, almost rocking on his heels. "They think he's respectable," Maigret repeated slowly, striking a match. Which means they don't know much more. He pays his rent. He nods in the stairwell. A man who avoids talk, commissaire. The pipe smoked evenly, filling the small room with its familiar haze. Maigret stared through it, seeing not Janvier, but the figure in the grey overcoat, hat on knees, sitting in that empty carriage as though the world had stopped around him. "And the wife?" "I didn't speak with her. A neighbor said she used to work in a dress shop but hasn't in some time. Health, perhaps, or something else." Maigret grunted. There was never a shortage of reasons why women disappeared into their apartments and rarely emerged again. He thought of Madame Maigret, bustling gently around their own kitchen, her life small but not stifled. He wondered what kind of silence reigned in the Pommier household. "Go back," he said. "Don't knock on the door. Talk to the concierge. Learn what she sees. Concierge see everything and say nothing unless asked. And Janvier, do it without eagerness. This isn't a case, only a thread." Janvier accepted the instruction without complaint, though his shoulders betrayed disappointment. Maigret let him go and sat for a time, the smoke curling upward. He had other work on his desk, reports, signatures, a note about a quarrel that had ended with a knife in a café in Belleville. Yet his eyes kept returning to the small notebook where, in his thick hand, he had written the name, Henri Pommier. 2 circles on a timetable. Later in the day, when the drizzle had grown heavier and the sky pressed low against the city, Maigret walked out again. He took an omnibus across the river and down into the 12th arrondissement. The streets there were narrower, lined with shops that smelled of leather, ink, and fresh bread. The buildings leaned slightly, their stones scarred by time, their shutters peeling paint. Rue de Charenton was alive with noise, carts rattling, boys shouting, women bargaining over vegetables. It was not an unfriendly street, but it was crowded, its life lived openly on the pavement. Number 192 stood at the corner where the street bent, a tall grey building with lace curtains behind many of the windows and laundry strung on lines across the courtyard. The concierge sat in her glass booth, knitting. She had the pale, flat look of a woman who has seen everything that goes on in a place and long since ceased to be surprised. Maigret pushed the door, his bulk filling the entryway, and gave his name with the kind of calm that never failed to disarm such women. "Pommier," she said, pursing her lips. "They've lived here 4 years. Quiet, both of them. The wife is delicate, pale, you know, doesn't go out much. He works, comes back, carries the shopping upstairs himself. I can't say a word against them." She hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "Though once, last winter, I heard them quarreling. Not loud, but sharp. A door slammed. I thought she might leave, but she didn't. Since then, silence." "Visitors?" Maigret asked. The concierge shook her head. "No one. They keep to themselves. He receives letters sometimes, thick ones, but always at work, never here. I see the envelopes when he drops them into the bin after reading. Business, perhaps." Maigret thanked her and climbed slowly to the 4th floor. He did not knock. He stood in the narrow corridor, listening. Behind one door a baby cried. Behind another, a radio played a tinny waltz. From the door marked Pommier, there was nothing, the kind of stillness that presses on the air, thick and private. He descended again, nodding at the concierge, and returned to the street. The drizzle had begun to mist his hat and coat, and he pulled the collar higher. Something in the quiet of that door, the absence of sound, had stayed with him. He could not yet name it, but he knew it was part of the same stone lodged behind his breastbone since the night before. At the corner cafe, he sat with a glass of white wine, his pipe resting cold on the table. Through the window he could see the entrance of number 192, the comings and goings of tenants, the endless rhythm of an ordinary Paris street. Nothing remarkable. Yet Maigret, who had spent his life waiting in such places, felt certain that patience would show its reward. He was not wrong. After half an hour, a figure appeared. Pommier himself, the grey overcoat buttoned, the hat set squarely on his head. He carried a small leather briefcase, worn at the corners, and walked with the steady pace of a man going nowhere in particular. Maigret watched as he crossed the street, glanced once toward the omnibus stop, then changed direction and headed down a side street instead. Maigret rose, leaving coins on the table, and followed at a distance. The rain had thinned, leaving the cobbles shining. Pommier walked without haste, without looking back, through streets lined with shuttered shops and into a quarter quieter than the one he had left. He turned at last into a cafe that sat almost empty, its windows streaked by rain. From outside, Maigret could see him sit at a corner table, place the briefcase beside him, and order a drink. He did not open the case. He did not read a paper. He sat, hands folded, staring at the glass as though waiting for time itself to dissolve inside it. Maigret entered, the bell above the door jingling softly. The barman nodded, accustomed to strangers, and Maigret ordered a beer. He chose a table not far from Pommier, but not directly across. From this angle he could see the man's profile, the deepening lines around his mouth, the faint hollow at his cheek. A man carrying more than his briefcase. They did not speak. They sat in the silence of cafes, where men pretend to be alone and yet know they are watched. Maigret drank slowly, refilling his pipe and letting the smoke drift. Pommier lifted his glass, drank, and set it down again. Minutes passed. The door opened once, admitting a woman with a scarf knotted tightly at her chin, who bought a packet of cigarettes and left. Otherwise, the cafe remained hushed, filled only with the clink of glasses and the faint hiss of rain outside. When at last Pommier rose, paying with exact change, Maigret let him go. He did not follow further. There would be time. Watching the man's shoulders retreat into the street, Maigret thought again of the 2 circles on the timetable. Montages. Nice. 2 directions, 2 lives. And a man who chose instead to sit in an empty carriage as though neither path suited him. He finished his beer, set the glass down carefully, and rose. There was no case, not yet. Only a man who sat in the wrong place, at the wrong time, carrying with him a silence that did not fit the ordinary rhythm of Paris life. Maigret stepped into the rain once more, patient, his hat pulled low, willing to wait until that silence cracked of its own accord and revealed the story beneath. The following day, the drizzle still hovered over Paris as if the sky itself was reluctant to give any clarity. The pavements shone slick beneath the feet of early workers, and the air had that damp heaviness which made collars rise and footsteps quicken. Maigret, though, walked at his usual pace, his coat swinging loosely around him, pipe stem between his teeth, eyes turned inward rather than outward. He had told himself there was nothing yet, no crime, no missing person, no complaint. And yet the picture of Henri Pommier in that grey overcoat would not leave him. A man could sit in the wrong carriage by chance, yes, but it was the deliberate stillness, the waiting, that gnawed at him. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Janvier already waiting, his expression more eager than the circumstances justified. "Commissaire, I spoke again with the concierge this morning. She says the wife is ill, but not in bed. Ill in another sense, if you understand. Nervous, withdrawn, rarely leaves the apartment, sometimes not even to collect the post." Maigret grunted, lowering himself into his chair. He opened the window a crack, though it let in only damp air. "And Pommier?" "He left as usual, same briefcase, same coat. She says he always comes home with shopping, as though he takes pride in managing what she doesn't." Janvier paused, and Maigret, with his pipe halfway filled, lifted his eyes. "But last night, after you followed him to that cafe, he didn't come straight home. He returned much later. The concierge noticed because she had stepped out to shake a rug." "That would interest her," Maigret muttered with a faint smile. "And what did he say to her?" "Nothing. He nodded politely, as always." The match flared as Maigret lit his pipe. He blew out the flame, the smoke curling as he leaned back. So the man who has lived 4 years without notice suddenly begins to sit in wrong carriages and stay out later than usual. "He could have a mistress," Janvier suggested, almost hopefully. Maigret gave a slow shake of the head. "If so, she is not the type who demands perfume in theaters. He carries something different, a burden perhaps." He waved a hand. "Leave it. We are not chasing a crime that may not exist, but—" He let the word hang, unfinished, and Janvier understood enough to remain alert. That evening, Maigret took himself again to Rue de Charenton, not because there was anything to do, but because patience sometimes required his presence. The street was darker now, the lamps throwing long reflections across the wet cobbles. From the café opposite, number 192, he observed again. Pommier came home as before, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He climbed the stairs, shoulders slightly bent. Nothing in his gait betrayed urgency or guilt. Inside the café, Maigret ordered a calvados and settled in, the warmth of the drink reaching through the damp. Around him, the usual customers talked in low voices, a trio of men arguing about football, a woman counting coins before ordering soup. Life ordinary, unremarkable. Yet above, behind those lace curtains, something pressed invisible against the walls. After some time, Maigret left his glass unfinished and crossed the street. He did not intend to knock, but he did. His knock was heavy but not urgent, the kind that told people it was easier to open the door than to resist. When the door swung back, a woman stood there, pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed larger than the rest of her face. "Madame Pommier." His tone was soft, almost apologetic. She nodded, her hand tightening on the edge of the door. She wore a house dress faded from many washings. The flat behind her smelled faintly of boiled potatoes and something medicinal. "I am Commissaire Maigret. Forgive me for disturbing you. I saw your husband yesterday evening, quite by accident, and it occurred to me." He let the sentence fade, waiting for her to invite him or refuse. For a long moment she looked at him, weighing something. Then she opened the door wider. "It is not much of a place," she said quietly, leading him inside. The sitting room was small, furnished with a worn sofa, a table covered by a crocheted cloth, and a sideboard with a few framed photographs. A pot simmered faintly on the stove in the adjoining kitchen. She motioned him to sit, and he lowered himself carefully onto the sofa, the springs complaining. "You saw Henri?" she asked, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "Yes, at the Gare de Lyon. Later, in a café. He seemed, how shall I say it, distracted." Her lips tightened. "He is often distracted. He carries the worries of others as if they were his own. Sometimes he comes home and sits for an hour without speaking. It is his nature." "Do you know why he was at the station that night?" She looked at him directly then, her gaze steady despite the tiredness in her face. "He told me he had gone for a walk, that he wanted to breathe air different from this street. It happens." Maigret studied her a moment, then nodded. He did not press further, not yet. He let the silence grow, filling the room with his presence. She fidgeted, her hands moving restlessly, her eyes flickering to the door as if fearing her husband's return. "He is a good man, Commissaire," she said suddenly, almost defensively. "He works hard. He never drinks more than a glass. He looks after me. If he seems elsewhere, it is only because life is heavy." Maigret inclined his head. "Of course, life is heavy for many." He rose, slowly, not wishing to overstay the fragile trust. "Forgive me again. I only wished to see." She escorted him to the door, and as she opened it, he thought he heard her whisper, so low it might have been only his imagination. "Don't let him fall." Back on the street, Maigret stood for a long time, the rain tickling his collar. He had not learned much, and yet he had. The woman's fear was not of her husband, but for him. She was guarding something, but whether it was his secret or his sorrow, Maigret could not yet tell. He returned the next day to the quay with this thought still pressing. In the squad room, Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You're circling, patron, like a dog who smells but doesn't bite." Maigret only grunted, lighting his pipe. Sometimes the bone shows itself if you circle long enough. By afternoon, he sent Janvier to discreetly check the paper wholesaler where Pommier worked. The report came back. Punctual, competent, a man who balanced the books with neat handwriting and never raised his voice. No complaints, no debts, no irregularities. A man invisible in his propriety. And yet Maigret knew the picture was incomplete. He could see Pommier's face still, waiting in the half-light of the carriage, his body present, but his spirit listening elsewhere. He thought again of the timetable with its 2 circles, 2 destinations, one chosen, one dreamed, neither taken. That night he returned once more to Rue de Charenton, his presence now a habit. The concierge greeted him without surprise, her knitting needles clicking. "He's gone out again," she murmured. "Same briefcase. Always the same briefcase." Maigret crossed to the café and took his seat by the window, ordering another Calvados. He waited. Minutes stretched, the hum of conversation ebbing and flowing around him. Then at last, the familiar grey overcoat appeared, shoulders hunched, hat brim low. Pommier walked not toward home, but away, disappearing into the damp streets with the briefcase at his side. Maigret left coins on the table and followed. He kept his distance, patient, watching the steady rhythm of the man's gait. Pommier did not look back. He walked with the air of a man rehearsing something in his head, each step measured, his silence deeper than the night around him. Maigrè's pipe smoke mingled with the mist as he followed, and he felt with a certainty that whatever secret Henri Pommier carried in that briefcase, it was not numbers or ledgers, not the dry routine of bookkeeping, but something heavier, something that had driven him into a carriage that no longer belonged to any train, waiting for a signal no one else could hear. And Maigré, steady as the rain, would wait too. The mist settled low over the rooftops that evening, the kind that blurred the lamps and muffled the sound of footsteps. Maigré walked several paces behind Henri Pommier, his own bulk blending into the flow of pedestrians, never close enough to alarm, never far enough to lose sight. The grey overcoat was easy to follow, a dull shade that caught the damp, but seemed to absorb the light around it. Pommier carried the briefcase with a curious precision, as though it were fragile, though Maigré guessed it contained nothing more ordinary than papers, or perhaps nothing at all. They passed through narrower streets where the shops were shuttered and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet plaster. Pommier did not hesitate at corners. His route was familiar, though his pace suggested no destination of urgency. At last, he turned into a quieter street, where only one cafe showed signs of life, its windows glowing faintly amber against the rain-dark walls. Maigré slowed, let a tram clatter past, then crossed over. From the doorway, he could see Pommier seated near the back, his briefcase placed carefully on the bench beside him. He was alone. His hat hung from a peg, and he stared down at a glass half filled with white wine. The scene was not unusual, not suspicious. 100 men sat like that across Paris every evening, weary of home, weary of routine, clinging to the hour between work and obligation. And yet in Pommier's stillness there was an intensity that set him apart, as though he were rehearsing in silence for some event no one else knew of. Maigré ordered a beer and sat at a table where he could watch without seeming to. The barman, a thin fellow with red hands, eyed him briefly and went back to polishing glasses. 2 other customers played dominoes in silence, their game punctuated only by the sharp clack of pieces on wood. Nothing in the cafe asked to be remembered. Half an hour passed. Pommier did not open the briefcase, did not read, did not even drink much. Once or twice he looked toward the door when it opened, as if expecting someone, but each time his face returned to its blank reserve. When at last he rose, Maigré felt no surprise that he left the glass unfinished. He replaced his hat, lifted the briefcase, and walked out into the mist with the same deliberate calm. Maigré followed again, patient, his pipe unlit between his teeth. The rain had thinned to a drizzle that slicked the cobbles and left the shop signs dripping. Pommier's path led him in a loop, back toward Rue de Charenton. He stopped once at a tobacconist's, still open late, bought a packet, and slipped it into his pocket without comment. He greeted no one. At number 192 he entered the doorway without a glance around. From across the street, Maigré watched the concierge shift in her booth. She looked up as if she had been waiting, saw Pommier pass, then settled again to her knitting. Nothing in her gesture betrayed suspicion, only the curiosity of one who keeps track of her tenants' rhythms. Maigré did not go closer. He walked away, his thoughts heavy. He had seen such patterns before. Men burdened by secrets that were neither grand crimes nor trivial whims, but something in between, something that weighed until it broke. He told himself he might leave it, let the man keep his silence. And yet the whisper of the wife returned to him. Don't let him fall. The following morning at the quay, the office smelled of damp coats and coffee. Janvier came in with a folder under his arm. Commissaire, I did as you asked. I spoke with someone at the paper wholesaler. They say Pommier is precise, dependable, but lately distracted. He makes mistakes in the sums, small ones. He apologizes, corrects them. They think perhaps his wife's illness is to blame. But one man said, off the record, that he sometimes sees Pommier with the briefcase even when he leaves the office empty-handed, as if he carries it for show. Maigret puffed at his pipe, brows heavy. A briefcase that holds nothing, or something he cannot leave behind. Janvier shrugged. It could be simple habit. Or it could be a weight, Maigret murmured. He looked out the window at the grey morning. Men carry their weights in leather and wood, in habits and silences. You'll see. Keep your ears open. By evening, Maigret returned again to the 12th. The drizzle had eased, leaving the air raw and cold. He sat once more in the café opposite 192. The same Calvados before him, the same quiet patience. He did not have to wait long. Pommier emerged, the briefcase at his side, his steps steady. Maigret followed, slower this time, not needing to prove anything to himself. Again the man walked to a café. Not the same as before, but another, just as nondescript, just as quiet. He chose a corner table, placed the briefcase beside him, and ordered a glass. And again he waited, silent, eyes occasionally drifting toward the door. This time, Maigret noticed something more. When a couple entered, their laughter too loud for the room, Pommier's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked away, but the briefcase shifted under his hand, as though he had to hold it to steady himself. Maigret let the evening stretch, then rose. He crossed to the counter, paid, and as he left, he allowed his eyes to meet Pommier's for the first time that night. There was no recognition, only a faint flicker, like the reflection of a passing lamp in a window pane. But it was enough. Back at home, over the meal Madame Maigret had kept warm, he said little. She asked about his day. He gave a vague answer. But later, sitting in his chair with the pipe between his teeth, he thought of the 2 circles on the timetable. Montargis. Nice. One circled for duty, the other for escape. A man seated between 2 futures, unwilling or unable to choose either, waiting in a carriage that belonged to no train. The next day brought more rain, heavier now, drumming on the river, making the streets run with rivulets. Maigret arrived at the quay with droplets still clinging to his coat. Before he could settle into his office, the telephone rang. Janvier answered, then looked over. It's the station police at Gare de Lyon, commissaire. They say Pommier has been seen again. Same carriage, same manner. Maigret rose at once, the heaviness in his chest turning to certainty. He tamped his pipe, slid it into his pocket, and reached for his coat. Come, Janvier. Some men go back to the place where their secret began. He's telling us, whether he knows it or not. They went together through the wet streets, the city thick with umbrellas and dripping hats. The station loomed, steam rising from engines, whistles echoing, and there, as before, in a dim carriage no longer in service, sat Henri Pommier, grey overcoat buttoned, briefcase on his knees, as if the world outside had nothing to do with him. Maigret stood at the doorway, watching. The man did not move, did not startle. He simply looked up, his eyes distant, and Maigret felt, with a slow certainty, that the time for silence was nearing its end. The carriage smelled of dust and stale tobacco, as if it had held too many lives for too long, and no one had thought to cleanse it. Maigret remained in the doorway, his heavy frame blocking the weak light from the platform lamps. Henri Pommier sat exactly as before, the briefcase balanced on his knees, his hands folded over it with a care that seemed both habitual and defensive. He did not flinch at the sight of the commissaire, but a faint tightening of the mouth betrayed recognition. "You've found your place again," Maigret said, his voice calm, almost conversational. He stepped inside, the boards creaking faintly under his weight. Twice makes it a habit. Pommier's eyes flickered toward the window where the rain streaked the glass, turning the lights of the station into trembling lines. "It is quiet here," he murmured. "Quieter than most places." Maigret lowered himself onto the opposite bench, his hat brim shadowing his face, pipe stem between his teeth, though unlit. He did not crowd the man with questions. He let the silence fill the carriage, thick and close, until the sound of a locomotive's hiss far down the platform seemed like the only interruption. Pommier shifted once, as though the quiet pressed too heavily, then stilled again. "You wait," Maigret said at last, his tone more an observation than an accusation. "But for what? A train that doesn't run? A voice that doesn't call?" Pommier's fingers tightened on the briefcase. "Everyone waits for something," he replied, and his voice carried a weary finality, as if he had spoken those words to himself many times before. Maigret studied him, noting again the careful polish of the shoes, the worn cuffs of the coat, the faint scent of barber's cologne already faded. Nothing extravagant, but everything controlled. A man who wished to leave no trace, and yet here he was, leaving one in his persistence. "I spoke to your wife," Maigret said gently, as though mentioning a mutual acquaintance. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Pommier's face. Alarm quickly smothered by resignation. "She shouldn't be troubled." "She is troubled already," Maigret countered softly. "Not of you, but for you. She asked me not to let you fall. Do you understand what she meant?" Pommier's shoulders sagged, a faint tremor passing through him. His lips parted as though to answer, then closed again. He looked down at the briefcase, as if it might supply the words he lacked. Maigret waited. He was patient. He had built his life on waiting. The sounds of the station shifted, porters calling, a whistle blowing, the shuffle of boots, but inside the carriage the air remained heavy, sealed. At length, Pommier sighed, a sound more of surrender than relief. "There are times," he said quietly, "when a man finds himself between two rails, both leading away, and he cannot step onto either. So he sits here between. It feels less like betrayal." "Betrayal of what?" Maigret asked gently. Pommier's gaze drifted back to the streaked window. "Of duty, of desire, of the life that was promised and the life that tempts." His hand shifted on the briefcase, stroking the leather. "I have a ticket for Montargis. My mother expects me. She is unwell and I am her son. That is duty, but I have also circled Nice. Not for duty, for escape. Sunshine, a different air. A life where no one knows me." His voice thinned as though speaking cost him something. "I sit here because as long as I am in the wrong carriage, I have not chosen. And while I do not choose, both lives remain possible." Maigret filled his pipe slowly, tamping the tobacco, though he did not strike a match. His eyes stayed steady on the man opposite. "And what of the briefcase?" he asked, his tone deliberately mild. Pommier's lips pressed together, then parted with a faint, almost bitter smile. He opened it. Inside lay not ledgers or documents, but a neat bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The envelopes were worn at the edges, some yellowed with time. He lifted them slightly, enough for Maigret to see, then replaced them as if the sight alone risked too much. "Not business," Pommier murmured. "Not even mine. Not anymore. A woman I knew once, years ago, before my marriage. She wrote often, and I kept them. I told myself they meant nothing, only souvenirs. But lately I find myself reading them again. They remind me of a self I might have been. And she's gone, married another perhaps. Or not. I have not seen her in 20 years. He gave a short, dry laugh. And yet I sit here, as if she might board at any moment and take the seat beside me. The train groaned as if in sympathy, metal straining in the damp. Maigret leaned back, smoke curling in his imagination, though the pipe remained unlit. He had seen men undone by jealousy, greed, pride. But this was different. Here was a man undone by the sheer weight of possibility, the ache of what might have been. "Does your wife know of these letters?" he asked. Pommier shook his head quickly. "She suspects only that I drift. She does not know why. I could not wound her with that knowledge. She has her own burdens. She is fragile. And so you wound her by silence instead," Maigret said, not accusing, only observing. Pommier's shoulders bent lower, as though the words had pressed him further into himself. He shut the briefcase with a quiet click. Perhaps. But silence is easier to carry than confession. For a long while, neither spoke. The station noises faded to a background hum, and the rain ticked gently on the roof. Maigret felt the stone in his chest ease slightly, not because the matter was resolved, but because the shape of it had begun to show itself. He had no crime, no charge, only a man balanced precariously on the edge of his own life. At last, Maigret rose, his knees creaking. "You cannot sit in the wrong carriage forever, Monsieur Pommier," he said quietly. "One day the train moves, and it will not ask where you meant to go." Pommier looked up, eyes weary but not hostile. "I know. But while it stands still, I'm allowed the dream." Maigret adjusted his hat, gave a small nod, and stepped back onto the platform. He did not order the man removed, did not summon the constables. He left him there, seated with his letters and his silence, the wrong carriage holding him as surely as any cell. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming on his shoulders as he walked toward the exit. The city breathed its damp breath around him, indifferent and patient. He lit his pipe at last, drawing deep, the taste grounding him. Some mysteries ended with handcuffs, others ended with a sigh and the recognition of human frailty. Yet as he walked away, Maigret felt the whisper of unease still. For all Pommier's quiet resignation, the words of the wife returned to him like a refrain. Don't let him fall. And he wondered, as the rain blurred the lamps and the Seine rolled dark beneath the bridges, how far a man could lean between two rails before gravity made the choice for him. The following morning broke with a damp chill that crept through the shutters, leaving a sheen of moisture on the window panes. Maigret lingered over his coffee, his pipe left cold beside the cup. Madame Maigret watched him quietly, accustomed to his silences, but able to sense when something gnawed beneath them. She did not ask. She buttered her toast carefully, the small domestic ritual steadying the air between them. When he finally rose, adjusting his heavy coat, she said only, "Take care not to catch cold. You've been out in the rain too much these days." He grunted in response, kissed her cheek, and stepped out into the grey morning. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the squad room buzzed faintly, papers rustling, the clatter of a typewriter echoing in one corner. Janvier appeared at once, eager as always, with a folded note in his hand. "Commissaire, word from Gare de Lyon. They say Pommier was there again late last night. The same carriage. Always the same carriage. The station guards are beginning to complain. They don't know whether to treat him as a loiterer or a lunatic." Maigret took the note, read it slowly, and slipped it into his pocket. His face remained heavy, unreadable, though inside he felt the stone press harder. A man might haunt a place once, even twice, but when he returned night after night, something more was at work. He rose without hurry, drew on his overcoat, and nodded for Janvier to follow. "Let them complain," he muttered. "It's often in the complaints of the small that the larger truth hides." The walk through the damp streets was unhurried, yet Maigret's mind circled steadily. He thought of the letters bound in ribbon, of the wife's whispered plea, of the silence that clung to Pommier like a second skin. He thought, too, of the 2 circles on the timetable. duty and escape, a son and a lover, Montargis and Nice. The man sat in the wrong carriage because it was the only place where both lives still seemed possible. At the station, they found the familiar porter, Léon, his cap pushed back on his head, his expression weary but curious. "He's there, commissaire," Léon said without preamble, jerking his thumb toward the line of carriages. "Same as before. Doesn't move, doesn't speak. The girl cleaning is afraid to go near him now. Says he sits like he's waiting for a verdict." Maigret thanked him with a nod and walked toward the coach, Janvier trailing just behind. The drizzle clung to the iron canopy, dripping in small, steady beats. The carriage door creaked as he pulled it open. And there, as though nothing had changed, sat Henri Pommier, grey overcoat neat, briefcase balanced, eyes fixed not on the commissaire, but on some distance only he could see. This time, Maigret did not sit. He remained standing in the doorway, his bulk filling the narrow frame. "Monsieur Pommier," he said in that slow, deliberate tone that allowed no escape, "you cannot haunt this carriage forever. People are beginning to notice. Soon it will not be me who asks questions, but others less patient." Pommier's hands tightened on the briefcase, but he did not look away. His lips parted, then closed again, the words struggling somewhere between thought and speech. Finally, he said, low and almost inaudible, "It was meant to be here. Once. A meeting. Years ago." Maigret waited, his pipe stem resting against his teeth, unlit. "She wrote," Pommier continued, voice faltering, "she wrote that she would meet me in a carriage, second class, after 8:50. I was young. I believed it. I sat here waiting as I sit now, but she did not come. Life went on. I married, I worked, I became respectable. Yet sometimes, when the air smells of rain and coal smoke, I remember. I return, as if time might fold and she might appear at last." Janvier shifted uneasily behind the commissaire, as though intruding on something too private. Maigret's eyes did not leave the man before him. "And the letters?" Pommier's chin dipped almost imperceptibly. "They are hers, all that remains. I keep them near in case I must remind myself that once someone spoke to me differently." The silence in the carriage thickened, broken only by the faint drip of rain against the roof. Maigret felt the ache of it. Not melodrama, not madness, but a quiet tragedy born of ordinary longing. A man who had built his life around ledgers and duty, but who had never quite stepped away from the promise of another life. "You have a wife," Maigret said softly. "A woman who still looks at the door each night, who asked me not to let you fall. She may not have written you letters, but she has waited too in her way." For the first time, Pommier's composure cracked. His eyes, dulled by habit, brightened with unshed tears. He pressed the briefcase harder against his knees, as if it were the last barrier between himself and collapse. "She deserves better," he whispered. "Better than a man who sits among ghosts. Better than silence," Maigret corrected gently. "Ghosts weigh less when spoken aloud. It is secrets that crush." The train whistle blew somewhere down the line, long and plaintive, and the carriage shivered faintly with the vibration. Pommier closed his eyes, as though hearing an echo from long ago, and when he opened them again, they were weary but clearer. He nodded once, a gesture small but decisive, as if acknowledging not the commissaire but the inevitability of truth. Maigret stepped aside, allowing the man to rise. Slowly, stiffly, Pommier stood, the briefcase still in hand. He adjusted his coat, smoothed his hat. When he looked at Maigret, there was no defiance left, only a tired acceptance. "I will go home now," he said. "You should," Maigret replied. He watched as the man walked past him, down the steps to the platform, and disappeared into the blur of passengers. Janvier moved closer, his brow furrowed. "Patron, are we just letting him go? There's no crime, no charge, but He isn't well." Maigret lit his pipe at last, the flame briefly illuminating his heavy features. He drew deeply, exhaling smoke that mingled with the damp air. "No crime, no charge," he repeated. "Only a man who has carried too long what should have been laid down years ago. If he stumbles, his wife will hold him. That is all that can be done." They left the station slowly, Maigret's steps unhurried, though his thoughts remained heavy. He had not solved a case, not uncovered a plot or a murder, but he had seen into the quiet ache of a man's life and perhaps nudged him toward confession, not to the police, but to himself and to the woman who still waited behind that silent door on Rue de Charenton. That evening, in his own apartment, Maigret ate in silence, the stew warm, the bread crusty. Madame Maigret watched him with her usual calm, not asking, but knowing enough. When, at tea, last he leaned back, pipe between his teeth, he said simply, "Some men sit in the wrong carriage, madame, not because they are lost, but because they cannot yet bear to arrive." She gave a small nod, her eyes tender, and poured him another glass of wine. The rain ticked on the windows, steady and patient, as if the city itself understood. Maigret, weary but at peace with his day, let the smoke curl around him, thinking not of crime solved, but of human frailty laid bare in the quiet places where no one looks. Yet even as he settled into the evening's calm, he felt the faintest echo of unease. A man like Henri Pommier could leave the wrong carriage, yes, but could he resist returning again when the weight of silence pressed once more? The commissaire knew he would keep his ear tuned for that name, that address, in the days ahead. Some stones, however light, never quite leave the breast. The morning held to a color that wasn't quite gray and wasn't quite white, the kind Paris keeps when it hasn't decided whether to dissolve into rain or simply hang low over the roofs. Maigret shaved with slow strokes, listening to the soft clink of crockery from the kitchen. He ate without hurry. Madame Maigret poured his coffee, and, as she wiped a clean circle on the misted window with the heel of her hand, said in that practical voice that sometimes struck truer than any report, "It is curious about men and trains. When a man truly means to go, he does not circle the timetable. He looks at the clock." He looked at her over the rim of the cup, and when he circles, "He's measuring a different thing than time," she said, letting the curtain fall back into place. "He is measuring permission." He took that with him, the words soft and persistent as the drizzle. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he went first not to his desk but to the telephone in the corridor, where the echoes of footsteps took their time crossing the stone. He asked the operator for the commissariat at Montargis. There was waiting, the changes, the long-distance pause, and then a dry provincial voice came on, agreeable enough. "Pommier," Maigret said, voice stripped of any official tone. "Madame Veuve Pommier, if you please." "Is she—" There was a rustle of papers, the careful pride of a man who kept his registers neat. "Died last spring, commissaire." "April, small funeral, buried in the communal cemetery, near the wall. No immediate family here. A cousin came from Nemours to stand at the grave." "Why?" "No reason," Maigret said, and thanked him as if it were a favor. He replaced the receiver and stood looking at the black earpiece in his hand, feeling the weight of the simple fact. He had suspected it without forming the suspicion. Now the shape of Pommier's duty circle altered. Not a destination, but a screen, a man set between himself and his own longing. In his office, Janvier had left a note. Nothing new at the paper wholesaler. The bookkeeper had balanced the petty cash to the centime, then stared 10 minutes at a blank page before writing a figure he later crossed out. It was the kind of detail colleagues brought to Maigret because they knew he liked such small, helpless gestures. They told him more than tidy alibis ever did. Near midday, he went to Rue de Charenton and climbed, as he had before, to the 4th floor. The concierge looked up without surprise and resumed her knitting the moment he passed. At the door, marked Pommier, he waited, listening. A chair moved faintly. When he knocked, the door opened almost at once. She had the same pale face, the same washed-out dress, but today there was a steadiness about her that had been absent, as if during the night she had chosen the weight she meant to carry and set her hands under it properly. "Madame," he said, removing his hat. She stepped back to let him in and closed the door carefully, as one does when the corridor listens. The room was tidy, more from habit than pride. He sat only when she did, lowering himself onto the sofa with a care that made the springs complain softly. The pot on the stove let out a thin sigh, and then settled. "He came home?" he asked. She nodded. "He came home. He slept poorly. I watched him in the light from the street, the way his eyes move even when he is still. He has done that for years, commissaire. It is not new, only heavier. Tell me, madame," he said, and the gentleness in his voice wasn't technique, it was fatigue shared. "Do you know about Montargis?" She let her hands rest flat on her knees, fingers extended as if smoothing a sheet. "His mother died last spring," she said, and in saying it, she freed the room of a certain politeness. "The curé wrote. I burnt the letter after I read it. I did not show it to Henri. Why? Because he had already bought the ticket he meant to buy. He came home proud, as if what he carried in his pocket balanced something her." She touched her breast, not dramatically. If a man must lie to himself to stand up straight, one does not rush to take away the lie. One waits until it shrinks by itself. "And the letters, madame?" Her lips moved toward a smile that did not complete itself. "You have seen them?" "I have seen the bundle. I have not read." "Nor have I," she said, and he believed her. "Once, when I went to fetch a handkerchief from the briefcase because he had none clean, I saw the ribbon. I put it back. I don't need to read the words to know their work. A woman recognizes the weight in a room even when the door's closed." The phrase sat between them, not brusque, not mystical, only exact. Outside, a cart rattled, a child called out about a marble. Inside, the clock on the sideboard ticked with almost comic sobriety. "Do you fear for him?" Maigret asked. "I fear the moment when he will discover that waiting does not hold the world still," she said. "He prefers the wrong carriage, because it does not move. But when a man stands too long between two rails, he grows tired. Tired men stumble." She looked at Maigret then, with eyes unaccusing and very tired. "I asked you not to let him fall. It was not an order, commissaire, only a prayer that someone might stand nearby when the stumble comes." He rose. He had never liked promising what had to be kept by other people's strength. He put on his hat and made for the door. Before she opened it, she said, almost as an afterthought, "There is a postcard. He keeps it in a book. It shows a row of palms and a wide sea. The stamp is not cancelled. The address is ours. He never sent it." "Nice," Maigret said, not as a question. She nodded. "Perhaps it is foolish of me, but sometimes I set it up right behind the clock. When the clock strikes, I imagine the waves move." He left her with that, and on the landing he paused, listening to the ordinary noises. The radio that never quite caught its station, water somewhere running, the pause before a cough as if the cough were thinking better of itself. He went down, nodded to the concierge, and stepped back into the street that had not changed. He did not go directly to the station. He walked a while first, through streets that sold leather straps and coffee, fish and paper, the smells shifting like weather. In a cafe where the glass steamed, he telephoned Gare de Lyon. Léon answered, and his voice reached across the line as it had through steam and rain on other nights. "He is not in the carriage now, commissaire," he said. "But there is a thing. The girl who cleans found a briefcase under the seat this morning. She brought it to the lost and found. Empty." "Empty," Maigret repeated. "Clean empty," Léon said with satisfaction at the exactness. "Not the way thieves leave it. Wiped like a plate. No crumbs. Maigret thanked him and went to the station, not with haste, because haste does not sharpen eyes. In the small glassed office, where umbrellas dripped into a tin tray and the calendar still showed last month's girl smiling beside a lake, the lost property clerk slid the briefcase across to him with both hands, as if it were an animal that might still bite. It was Pommier's, the same worn leather, the small scratch on the buckle. Inside, nothing. Not even dust, as Léon had said. The absence felt heavier than any bundle. On the concourse, the big clock marked 3:15. A train to the coast would back in at 5. He went to the platform where the 8:50 from Lyon habitually let its passengers out to rub their eyes and rebutton their coats. The carriage where Pommier had sat was coupled now to others, doors closed. Rain made a faint tapping sound on the roof, the way a man taps a table when he has decided. He found Léon, who tipped his cap and confided that he liked order but was not cruel. He had waved away a junior who wanted to push the man along. "He's no drunk," Léon said, and there was a certain pride in the human accounting of it. "He's the sort a station keeps safe if it can." Maigret stood at the end of the platform where buffers hold back mistakes. The smell there was different, more metal, more oil, as if the station breathed in through its nose. He did not have to turn when Pommier came. He knew by the change in the air, the subtle shifting of attention, people give a man who belongs and does not. The grey overcoat stopped beside him, not too close. "You left the briefcase," Maigret said, as if telling a man he had set down his umbrella. "I needed both hands free," Pommier said. He wasn't being clever. He looked at his own fingers as if they were instruments he had not yet learned to play. "One cannot hold letters and go home." "Your mother is dead," Maigret said. It was not cruelty. It was a plank laid flat over a gap. Pommier's head lowered, a bow toward a fact. "Yes," he said. "Yes. I knew you would know. I told myself the ticket was for duty. It was because duty is an easier word for a man to carry out of the house than longing." "And nice?" "Nice is the air men say cures a chest," he said, and a thin smile touched his mouth and fled. "Do you know, commissaire, I once stood at the ticket window and asked for the price. The man told me and I thanked him and went away. It was like asking the price of a suit I would never wear, only to feel for a second what it is to own it." They stood without speaking. A pigeon flew the length of the canopy, ragged, sure. Far down the line, shunting, a coupling clanged, the sound travelling along the rails like a rumour. "Your wife knows about montages," Maigret said. "She does not know what is in the letters because she has chosen not to know. There is a difference. She is kind," he said, and for a moment the word rode the breath as if it were enough to make a man stand up straight. "I have not deserved that kindness lately." "Kindness can be deserved tomorrow," Maigret said. He tapped his pipe bowl lightly with a finger. "If you have made the briefcase empty, keep it that way a day. Allow the house to hold you. Tonight, do not circle. Look at the clock." Pommier turned his face toward the yards where the lines made their patient diagrams and men in caps worked without hurry. "It is a strange thing," he said slowly, "how a man can put down one weight and feel the other more. Without the letters, I have no excuse left." "Excuses are only heavy when they are carried for two," Maigret said. "Go home and tell her the truth she already almost holds. If she asks you to burn anything, burn it in the stove and stand with her while it burns." He waited for protest. None came. Pommier's shoulders shifted, not squaring, not collapsing, but adjusting to a new fit. He looked smaller to Maigret and at the same time more visible. He nodded, the simple, grave nod of a man saying yes to a fact that will not change for his refusing. Then he went, not quickly, not slowly, walking as men do when the pavement is known and the doorway is not far. Maigret remained a little while longer because a station has ways of showing you the piece you missed if you rush. He watched the cleaners laugh at something that had no malice in it. and Léon argue mildly about a schedule, and a boy, too young for the uniform he wore, count the coins in his pocket twice before buying a coffee and leaving one coin in his hand for luck. Then he took the empty briefcase, not because he needed it, but because emptiness sometimes tempts theft, and he preferred to be responsible for this particular absence. Outside, the air had not changed. It would not until evening. He rang the quai from the kiosk near the flower cellar and told Janvier there was nothing to record. He meant the kind of nothing that takes up a whole page in a man's life. When he hung up, the flower seller lifted a carnation and asked, with the direct courtesy of her trade, "For Madame?" He shook his head. "Not today." He thought of the postcard propped behind the clock, and of the clock striking, and of a woman watching the waves move only inside her head. On the way back, he stopped in a cafe he had never entered, and drank a beer without tasting it. He was tired in the way that came from standing near other people's choices. When he reached the bridge, he paused under the iron, looking down at the Seine shouldering past, indifferent and continuous. A man could step into such a greyness and be gone without ripple, but most did not. Most went home and put water on to boil and, if they were honest that day, said a thing that pressed on the air and then made it easier to breathe. He walked on, hat low, coat heavy, already prepared to sleep well if the telephone did not ring. And if it did ring, he would rise with the same patience. A city like Paris did not promise that men would not return to the wrong carriage. It promised only that there would be someone to notice when they did, and to stand in the doorway until they looked at the clock. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of rain, the kind that dampened even the bells of the trams and made the air taste faintly of rust. Maigret found himself thinking of Henri Pommier more often than he admitted, not as one thinks of a suspect, but as one thinks of a patient whose fever has broken, yet whose recovery is not assured. He passed through his usual rounds. Reports on petty quarrels that had ended in knives, a shopkeeper caught fiddling weights, the endless machinery of the city's small crimes. But Pommier's face, grey and waiting, lingered behind the smoke of his pipe. On the third day, a note from Janvier arrived on his desk. It was brief. "Patron, Pommier has not returned to the station. Concierge says he has been home each evening, quietly. No briefcase, no wandering." The message was delivered without comment, but Maigret felt the subtle relief behind the words, the satisfaction of seeing an irregularity return to the neatness of routine. He folded the note and placed it inside his notebook, not as evidence, but as one files a reminder that a man has chosen, for the moment, to live in his own life. That evening, after a long day of listening to the complaints of a particularly pompous examining magistrate, Maigret walked not toward home, but toward the 12th arrondissement. The drizzle had given way to a steady mist, the kind that blurred lamps and made the air heavy with coal smoke. He entered the café opposite number 192 and ordered his calvados, sitting by the window. He told himself it was habit more than duty, but he knew better. He wanted to see whether the window of the 4th floor glowed or stayed dark, whether the rhythm of that house had truly changed. Through the steamed glass, he saw shadows passing. The usual tenants, the old woman with her basket, a boy with muddy shoes, the concierge slipping out briefly to gossip with a neighbor. And then, after some time, the faint shape of Henri Pommier at the window of his flat, standing motionless, head bent slightly. He was not holding the briefcase. There was no sense of waiting, only of someone pausing between tasks. A lamp flickered behind him, and a second shadow moved across. The wife, adjusting the curtains. The faint domesticity of it, the smallness, reassured Maigret more than any official report. He finished his glass, paid, and walked out into the mist, letting the matter rest at last. But Paris is not generous for long. 2 days later, the call came from the local commissariat. A body had been found in the Seine, near the Pont d'Austerlitz. Maigret went himself, the drizzle turning to hard rain as he reached the quay. The water slapped against the embankment, brown and swollen. Two policemen stood awkwardly, coats dripping, beside the stretcher laid out under the arch of the bridge. A fisherman had spotted the bundle caught against the pilings. The corpse was bloated, its features softened by the water, but the grey overcoat was recognizable. The briefcase was not there. Maigret stood, hat low, pipe stem clenched between his teeth, the rain soaking the brim. He did not speak at once. He studied the figure, the lines of the drowned man's hands, the way the collar still clung stubbornly to the neck. At last he said quietly, "Henri Pommier." The policemen glanced at him, surprised by the certainty, but they did not question it. He had seen too many faces to be wrong, even when the water blurred them. Later, at the mortuary, the wife confirmed it with a broken nod. She said little else, only that he had left the flat after supper, telling her he would take a short walk before bed. He had seemed calmer, she added, almost peaceful. She had believed him. She had even allowed herself to think the storm had passed. Her hands twisted the hem of her coat as she spoke, and she did not cry. The tears, Maigret knew, had already been shed long before, during the years of silence. At the quay, the report was written in the dry bureaucratic tone that left no space for the human ache beneath it. Male, age 52, bookkeeper, death by drowning. Circumstances undetermined. No evidence of foul play. A routine drowning, nothing more. The file could have been closed with that, but Maigret, pipe smoke clouding the office, could not let it settle so easily. He returned to the station once more. The same porter, Léon, was on duty, his cap askew, his face sober. "It was bound to happen, wasn't it, commissaire?" he said softly. "A man doesn't sit in a carriage that long unless he's waiting for the last train." Maigret didn't answer. He went to the platform where the 8:50 from Lyon arrived, where the carriages gleamed under the misting rain. He opened the door of the second-class coach where Pommier had sat so often. The seat was empty, but the air still carried something of him, as if waiting had left a trace. Maigret lowered himself onto the bench, hat in hand, pipe in the other, and sat. He looked out through the rain-streaked window at the blurred lights of the station. He could almost imagine the man beside him, briefcase on his knees, eyes turned inward. For a long time he sat there, silent, letting the noises of the station rise and fall around him. The cries of porters, the hiss of steam, the shuffle of passengers. He thought of the wife's whisper, "Don't let him fall," and of the postcard of Nice propped behind the clock. He thought of the empty briefcase, left under the seat, as if Pommier had wanted to shed the weight of the letters before he stepped into the river. A gesture of release, perhaps, or of surrender. When at last he rose, he carried with him the heaviness of knowledge that no report could hold, that some men are not defeated by crimes or betrayals, but by the quiet erosion of possibility. Henri Pommier had lived between two rails too long, and when the choice could no longer be avoided, he had chosen neither. That night, back at his apartment, Maigret said little. He ate what Madame Maigret set before him, nodded at her quiet talk of the market, and afterwards sat in his chair with the pipe smoke curling around him. He did not tell her of the drowned man, of the letters, of the wrong carriage. He did not need to. She looked at him once, steady, and seemed to know. The rain tapped against the windows. In the silence, Maigret thought not of evidence or procedure, but of the weight of human longing, of the lives circled but never taken, and of how many men sat in the wrong carriage each night, unseen. And he thought, too, of how little the world noticed when one of them, at last, failed to rise from the bench. The following days blurred into one another, as often happened after a body was pulled from the Seine. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the papers were signed, the reports filed. The official line fixed, accidental drowning, no suspicious circumstances. Janvier asked once, tentatively, if there was more to it, but Maigret only shook his head. There was always more, but not the kind the examining magistrate or the prosecutor wanted to hear. What could he tell them? That a man had been drowned not by water, but by waiting. That he had carried letters like ballast until he could no longer stand upright. Such things had no place in official files. He found himself walking slower through the corridors, his pipe left unlit more often, the smell of wet stone and paper dust thick in his nose. Other cases demanded his attention, petty thefts, a quarrel in Montmartre that had left one man with a broken bottle in his thigh, a gang of boys caught stripping copper wire from a warehouse. All of it routine, all of it solvable. And yet, when he closed his office door and leaned back in his chair, the image that came to him was not of suspects or evidence, but of the empty seat in that second-class carriage, rain streaking the window, silence filling the air. One evening, when the work had thinned and the sky hung low with clouds, he walked to Rue de Charenton. He had no official reason, only the tug of unfinished business. The concierge looked up from her booth and did not comment when he entered. She only lifted her needles in acknowledgement and went back to her knitting. At the 4th floor he knocked, and the door opened after a pause. Madame Pommier stood there, paler than before, though there was a strange composure in her eyes. She let him in without a word. The flat was unchanged. The worn sofa, the crocheted cloth, the simmering pot that seemed always to be on the stove. A photograph of Henri as a younger man had been set on the sideboard, framed hastily in black ribbon. She gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself slowly, hat in his hands. "He has been buried," she said quietly. A small ceremony. A cousin came from Namur and 2 men from his office. It was very short. Maigret nodded. He did not know what words would comfort, and so he did not try. Silence was often kinder than clumsy sympathy. After a while, she rose and brought a small bundle from the sideboard drawer. The letters, still tied with the faded ribbon. She set them on the table between them, her hands resting lightly on the top envelope. "They gave me his things," she said. This was in the briefcase, after all. Not empty, as they said. He must have returned for them before the river. I found them hidden under the lining. Maigret looked at the bundle, but did not reach for it. "Have you read them?" She shook her head. Number Y thought of it. But then I thought, why? They belonged to a time before me, to a man I never knew, not really. If I read them, I would only be reading a stranger. And yet... Her hands tightened faintly. And yet they were in my house all these years, in the briefcase he carried every day. Her voice did not tremble, but her eyes shone faintly in the dim light. Maigret leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Madame, sometimes we keep such things not because they mean more than the present, but because they remind us that once we had choices. Your husband lived between those choices too long. Perhaps the letters gave him comfort. Perhaps they weighed him down. Likely both. But they do not change what he was with you." She listened, her gaze fixed on the bundle. At last, she gave a small nod and pushed it toward him. "I don't want them here. Take them, commissaire. Do what you think right." For a long moment he looked at the faded ribbon, the neat stack of paper. Then he reached out, lifted the bundle, and placed it carefully inside his coat. He did not promise to burn them, nor to keep them. He simply carried them away, relieving her of the burden. On the street, the air was heavy with drizzle, the lamps glowing faintly through the mist. He walked slowly, pipe unlit, the letters pressing lightly against his chest. He thought of Pommier's face, weary but not cruel, and of the wrong carriage where he had sat waiting for a life that never came. He thought, too, of the wife, pale and steady, who had asked not for justice, but simply that he not be allowed to fall. Back at his apartment, Madame Maigret had left the lamp lit for him. She looked up as he entered, noting the heaviness in his step. He set his hat aside, hung up his coat, then placed the bundle of letters on the table without explanation. She did not ask. She brought him his supper, warm and simple, and afterward poured him a small glass of brandy. When he had eaten, he sat back in his chair, pipe between his teeth, and watched as she picked up the letters, weighed them in her hand, and then set them gently into the drawer of the sideboard. No words passed between them. It was enough. The rain thickened outside, rattling faintly against the window. Maigret drew on his pipe, letting the smoke curl around him. He felt no triumph, no resolution, only the quiet ache of human frailty that lay at the heart of so many cases, solved or unsolved. In the end, Henri Pommier had not been a criminal, nor a victim of crime. He had been a man who waited too long in the wrong place, until the waiting itself became heavier than life. And as Maigret sat there, with the warmth of brandy in his chest and the steady presence of his wife nearby, he thought again of that carriage at Gare de Lyon, dim and silent, and of all the men who might be sitting there still, invisible to the world, circling timetables they would never follow, listening for voices that would never come. The letters remained in the drawer for a week, untouched. Maigret had not opened them. He did not need to. Their presence in his apartment was reminder enough of what they were. Fragments of a life Henri Pommier had once dreamed of, a life that had never arrived, a life he could neither live nor forget. Some evenings, as he sat with his pipe, he would glance toward the sideboard, but his hand never moved to pull the drawer open. He was not curious about the woman who had written them, nor the words that had tethered a man for 2 decades. He already knew enough. It was not the content of the letters that mattered, but the silence they had created. One rainy afternoon, after a long day of paperwork and endless meetings with a magistrate who insisted on detail for detail's sake, Maigret left the quay and walked slowly to the Seine. He carried the bundle in his pocket, heavy despite its size. The water was swollen from the week's rains, brown and restless under the bridges. He stopped near the Pont Neuf, where the river widened, and stood for a long moment, the bundle resting in his palm. Then, with no ceremony, he dropped it into the current. The ribbon loosened as the letters fanned, ink and paper dissolving into the water, vanishing into the flow that had claimed Pommier himself. He stood smoking while the rain thickened, his hat brim dripping, until the water showed no trace. Only then did he turn and walk away. It was not justice, nor closure, but a gesture of respect, letting the words sink where they could no longer weigh on anyone. At home, Madame Maigret said nothing when he returned without them. She placed a warm plate before him, and when he muttered something about the river, she gave a quiet nod, understanding without needing to be told. It was the kind of understanding that made silence bearable. In the days that followed, the city resumed its ordinary pace. There were brawls in cafes, burglaries in back streets, petty frauds in offices. Life demanded his attention, and Maigret gave it, as he always did. Yet now and then, passing the Gare de Lyon, he would pause at the concourse, listening to the distant whistles, watching the passengers hurry with their bags. And he would think of the wrong carriage, and of a man who had sat there waiting for a life that never arrived. He did not think of it with bitterness, nor with pity. Only with the weary compassion that was his truest tool, the knowledge that most lives carried such hidden corners of silence. He could not save Pommier. He could only bear witness to his waiting and ensure that his silence was not forgotten. That evening, back in his chair, with his pipe drawing steadily, the rain pattering against the window, Maigret allowed himself a small sigh. The case had left no arrests, no charges, no triumph. But it had shown him again the weight men carried quietly, the burdens that crushed not with violence, but with time. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the soft sounds of his wife in the kitchen, and thought, Paris was full of men in the wrong carriage, and he would keep watch, as best he could, until the last train called. Chat-G, 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 Chat-G. Chat G, Chat G, Chat G, Chat G.